Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Social Security is something that a lot of us look forward to after having much of our money taken out over the years through our W-2 form of taxes to be sure that there's something there at the end for us to retire on and to have benefits with. It was a program that, as I understand it, was created because there was pretty much known that Americans probably weren't great savers, and it was a way to ensure that at least a little bit was put away so you didn't have anything to worry about at the end of the rainbow when it was time for you to watch the golden sunset. But over the years, we've been hearing that Social Security simply just isn't there anymore, and it was understood that it started back during the Ronald Reagan years. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's considered to be a lonely voice crying in the wilderness. And he brings us unwelcome news to let us know where it is, what happened, and what can be done about it. The book is Ronald Reagan and the Great Social Security Heist. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Alan Smith. Alan, how are you today?
It's good to be here.
Well, you know, it's pretty alarming when I read in the book that you're talking to a CNN anchor correspondent, and he says, you know, I don't know about this as the news, I am the news, and the fact that somebody from CNN actually believes they're the news is kind of alarming in and of itself. But anyway, tell us what happened there.
Okay. I first discovered this horrible situation involves actually government fraud in the Social Security Fund 13 years ago in early 2000. I wrote my first book entitled The Alleged Budget Surplus, Social Security, and Voodoo Economics. And as soon as I got that out, I sent it out to news media and so forth. Well, CNN invited me to come on in their afternoon news show and talk about that. And I was all set. I was going to straighten that up right then and there. And it was Lou Waters was the anchor in Atlanta at that time. So I just came on there ready to tell the American people, and I thought that would be it. I spent the last 13 years and more than $50,000 of my own money trying to get this message out, because what happened on CNN was he just laughed, sort of took it like a joke, and then he said, well, I'm not hearing any of this in the news. Are you a voice crying in the wilderness? And that's exactly what I've been for the last 13 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, why is it that nobody's willing to listen or wanting to listen, do you think?
Okay. This is, I don't want to get into so-called conspiracy theories and so forth, but this is something the government has been hiding from the American people for 30 years. This happened over a 30-year period. Now, it all started in 1983 with the enactment of the Social Security Amendments of 1983. This was a law that radically changed the way Social Security was financed. And my guess is very few of your listeners even know that there was major Social Security legislation in 1983 that radically changed things. I've never seen it in the news. I've never heard anybody talk about it. And that's it. It laid the foundation for the greatest fraud against the American people ever, and the biggest group of those are the baby boomers. Mm-hmm. It was a ripoff of baby boomers, and the baby boomers have had $2.7 trillion of their money spent by the government in the period since. Now, I've been on CNBC, and I've been on the Dolans, and I've been on various others. Not everybody was as hesitant as he, but here's what happened. Ronald Reagan comes in 1980, 81, he became president. Those of you, I'm sure everybody in here is old enough to remember his slogan on that campaign. It just scared me to death at the time as an economist. Reagan went around and he'd get up in front of an audience and say, if you elect me president, I'll cut your tax rates by 10% during my first year in office. And the crowd would start to cheer. And he'd let them cheer for just a little bit, and then he'd hold his hand up. Wait a minute, I'm not done. If I'm elected president, I'll cut your taxes another 10% in my second year of office. This time he let them cheer a little longer, and then he stops them again. He said, wait a minute, I've got an encore. if I'm elected president, I will cut your taxes another 10% in the third year. I am going to cut tax rates by 30%. And I will not have to cut back on spending. We're going to bring inflation, unemployment down, a whole bunch of other things. And that was a suicidal type thing for our nation. And I just hoped against the whole that there's no way that Congress would pass or he'd go through with it. Okay, he did. And we had this radical cut in the federal budget and the income tax cut. Well, Reagan was in deep trouble, from the very beginning. His budget director, David Stockman, when they first got access to the computer at the federal government in the Office of Management and Budget, he went in and put Reagan's proposal into the computer that had been programmed by economists of the past as a model of the U.S. economy that showed what will happen if you do this. And that computer came back with just devastating news. It just said this would just be horrible. We'd have massive budget deficits and so forth. Well, Stockman knew that he could not sell that, and Reagan couldn't sell that to the public, so he rigged the computer. And this is all, he admitted to all this in the infamous The Education of David Stockman that came out during that early part of that period. And he said, well, there's no way to get the numbers, so we rigged the computer. Well, Reagan at that time, the Congressional Budget Office had been doing studies, and they said, Reagan's numbers don't seem right. And the reporters would try to stop Reagan and say, what's the difference? And he said, oh, they're trying to shoot down my program with phony numbers. Well, there were phony numbers involved, but it wasn't the Congressional Budget Office. So here's what happened is that you had this terrible crisis in terms of revenue for the federal government. So how are you going to get out of this? He could have just told the people, well, I made a mistake, I made a misjudgment, I'm going to have to raise your income taxes back up because we don't have enough money. But Alan Greenspan, who I'm sure everybody knows, and he's been involved in an awful lot of shady things over his lifetime, Alan Greenspan came up with a plan. He said to Mr. Reagan, well, maybe you don't have to raise income taxes. What if we raised the payroll tax on Social Security? That's just sort of like an income tax. And then we diverted that money right over into the general fund and used it just like income tax. Now, these things all happened. The plan was set forth. Reagan and Greenspan sold it to the Congress. They rushed that through. They actually got the whole legislation rushed through in 3 months. And they convinced the American people, and they convinced the Congress to vote it in, that this was a big thing to help Social Security. They were going to make sure Social Security was taken care of. Okay, that's what they told the people. That Social Security amendments of 1983, what they did was have a radical increase in payroll taxes. And I'm sure most of your listeners remember that going up. I think it almost doubled at the time. And Reagan claimed, this is going to stabilize Social Security, and what it was supposed to do at that time, that money was tax was to generate surpluses for the next 30 years in the Social Security budget, and that those surpluses were supposed to be saved, and they were supposed to be invested in marketable U.S. Treasury bonds. And if that had all been done, we wouldn't be on the phone today. If that had all been done today, the baby boomers, they would have $2.7 trillion in marketable Treasury bonds in there, and no problem whatsoever for another 20 years. Not one dime of that money ever went to Social Security in any way. They literally, and it's hesitant when you're talking about the government to use things like stealing and embezzlement and so forth, but that's exactly what happened. The government started embezzling that money as soon as it started coming in. It first came in under Reagan, and when the money came in, they just used it for, a large amount of the early money went to finance the big tax cuts for the rich. You had these big tax cuts, and they lost all that revenue, and this Social Security tax had a big impact on that. The money was, to a large extent, a large amount of money was taken from the baby boomers in the form of payroll tax increase, and was used to pay for the tax cuts of the very wealthy. And so what we had really was a redistribution of income at that point. Now, if you want, I'll pause a while and let you talk some, because I'm used to answering questions, but I'm just trying to get this foundation out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes a lot of sense, and you were also talking in the book about how our budget deficit began to increase starting in the Reagan administration, and the phenomenal levels that it increased to, where there was all this overspending, and so the way they went to correct that is, well, let's dip into Social Security. After all, especially according to Republicans, we're not entitled to that money anyway. Now, that to me is a little alarming. So what we're hearing is you're making us take this money out of our paychecks so that way we save. Okay. But then you're telling us we're not entitled to that once that money's been taken out. Now, when I think of a guy like Paul Ryan, which was to me kind of a joke when he went up there to, be somebody running for vice president. Are you kidding me? Who is this guy? And that he's one of the proponents that says this. I'm thinking, well, Paul, why don't I just go to your savings account and take all of your money out and use it any way I want to? After all, you're not entitled to that. But that seems to be the attitude they have. Why is that?
Okay, I'm glad you brought up Paul Ryan, because that allows me to get into a whole other dimension that also involves Alan Greenspan. I don't know how many people knew who Ayn Rand was.
Right,
but
remember.
She was a very prolific, her books she's dead now, but her books are selling more copies than ever. I see her as just almost a counterpart of Karl Marx. Karl Marx died and had all his philosophy, and years after his death, the communists used that for the Communist Revolution. Well, she was in Russia at that time. She was among the Russian elite, and her dad had a business and so forth. So she got out of there and came to the United States, did some very shady things to get in, but she finally married a man, and she got citizenship. So then she started writing, and her sympathies and everything was that the rich have been ripped off, and we've got to reverse this back the other way. One of her books, and I would urge anybody to read this if you can, you'll have trouble stomaching it, is entitled The Virtue of Selfishness. The Virtues of Selfishness. That's an entire nonfiction book. And she goes through there and says that we are not our brother's keeper. The whole idea of trying to help others is wrong. She says anybody who goes out and helps somebody else is committing a crime against society and all this. And she can divide the population into what Ryan today uses makers and takers, but she had more severe, she called them parasites and producers and like. And Alan Greenspan now was one of her top men for 20 years. He was a part of this movement from the very beginning. To show how close he was to Ayn Rand, when he was sworn in the White House as President Ford's chief of the Council of Economic Advisors, Ayn Rand was standing there right beside him. I've got pictures of it. And this crazy movement she had started had now made it all the way to Washington in the form of Alan Greenspan. Paul Ryan is a devout follower of her, and so is the whole right wing and the Tea Party. What they want to do is not turn the time clock back and go back to earlier times. They want to impose a radical new system on the American people, which will be primarily ruled by the wealthy, plutocracy or something of that sort. They've got their various things, but they believe that most people are deadbeats, including those who are working hard at jobs, you might recall from Romney's 47%, that's what it's all about. Paul Ryan requires all of his staff members to read her books as part of their job of coming in. Clarence Thomas, one of the Supreme Court justices, he is another fan of hers, and he requires his new law clerks to come to his home for a movie on one of her books. And so very few people know about this angle, but the Ayn Rand beliefs and stuff, she's dead, but she's more popular than ever, and the books are selling, and they've got organizations behind her. It's a movement. It's a movement to try to move the United States in the direction of Tsarist Russia. And that's very scary, but I just wanted to bring that in because Alan Greenspan, 20 years, he was one of her top disciples and a very close friend, and he still, to this day, he's still living and he still supports her and advocates the things she advocates.
Now that we understand what the problem is, what is the solution to this?
There's only one solution, true solution, but let me go a little further. The fact is that $2.7 trillion of money has been stolen. Mm-hmm. It's missing. It's not there. Now, the government used that for various things, finance wars and tax cuts and so on. That money should be repaid. If that money were repaid, we wouldn't have a problem. If it had never been embezzled, we wouldn't have a problem. If it were repaid, we wouldn't have a problem. Now, the big problem here is the structural problem of the economy and so forth. Where are they going to come up with $2.7 trillion? Well, where I would say they should put it is that most of that money went to the very rich, the super rich, as a transfer from the Social Security over to that group. I would think that they needed a temporary surtax imposed on that very group to get the money back. But more likely, the best we can do is to try to get some legislation that requires the repayment of this over the next 30 years. If they did that, that would also do the problem. But the other aspect of this that I want to get in here, everybody's aware of a lot of talk about income and wealth distribution in the United States. The records, all the numbers showing it. Obama talks about it. Well, has there been a major shift, a redistribution of income from the poor to the wealthy? Is it a Robin Hood in reverse type situation where you're stealing from the poor and giving it to the rich? And the answer to that is yes, and the mechanism where that all happened was this 1983 Social Security amendments. What they did was to give big tax cuts. They lowered the tax rates of the very wealthy. At the same time, they raised the tax rates on the very poor. Now, people didn't quite make that connection because what they raised them on was called a payroll tax. But now the payroll tax, not very much is paid by very wealthy people. You only pay up to a little over $100,000, and all the rest of your income is exempt. So that increase in the payroll tax was money that was used to transfer to the wealthy. In other words, you raise taxes on the rich, lower on the rich, and you raise it on the poor. That's never been done in our history before, but it was done this time. There's a number of people who have picked up on that, a number of articles and stuff out there in the literature, but that is the biggest impact, overall impact, is they took money from the Social Security fund and used it to replace the lost money from the other. And it's just it's a terrible situation. When I found out about this 13 years ago, I was so upset. I thought all I had to do is go to a newspaper office or someplace and tell this to the news, tell this to the people, get this out. And I went on CNN, and he just sort of joked about it. There was not a lot of knowledge at that time of what was going on, but it was going on, and I've published about 6 books on the subject. I've been for 13 years. I have devoted my life some of the best years of my life, and I'm 75 years old just now, so I fit in this group, to trying to get this out. And it's a lot more complicated and sophisticated than meets the eye. Mm-hmm. We have a situation in this country where I believe that the media, mainstream media, is now in the pocket of the federal government. And they will not report anything the federal government does not want to report it. Mm-hmm. So what you have is a big theft. Make sure everybody understands that. By this law, by putting this in, they raised payroll taxes, but they took the money and put it over into the general fund. None of it went to Social Security. $2.7 trillion was raised that way, and it was a redistribution of income. And the fact now is that the baby boomers are retiring, and let me just say this. I have this one place in my notes to make sure I mention that the baby boomers were ripped off in a great way. Here's what changed. Let me talk about how Social Security was financed before '83 and after. From 1935, from the passage of the Social Security Act, to 1983, we had pay-as-you-go system, where the tax rates on payroll taxes were set just high enough to make payments to people. Some years there'd be a little deficit, and some years there'd be a little surplus, but most years you had approximately balanced budget. So there wasn't any idea of paying for future people. Each generation was required to pay for their parents' generation. Well, here's where radical change took place in 1983. The baby boomers were required to do the same as always. They were required to pay for their parents' generation. But here's the new twist. They were also required to prepay the cost of their own benefits. The studies at that time showed how much of a problem there was going to be when the baby boomers retired, and so they were asked to prepay most of the cost of their own benefits. And most baby boomers listening out there, most of you have already paid for your benefits, but the money has gone someplace else. And so it generated these big surpluses if the money had been used like it was supposed to be, if it was saved and invested in marketable U.S. Treasury bonds, that's the same kind that China have and so forth, then there'd be no problem at all. The government could just sell those bonds and pay benefits. The Social Security Trust Fund is empty. There is nothing of any value in the Social Security Fund. It's IOUs of the government. They can't be sold. They can't be traded. They are nothing but literally a record of how much money the government has stolen. So the baby boomers have got hit harder than anyone else. They were hit with a double whammy. They had to pay the same taxes on their parents' generation, but they were supposed to prepay their own. And this prepayment of their own things is where all that money came from that has been misused and been taken from Social Security and put into the general fund. Mm-hmm. So now that's why we're in a crisis now. The baby boomers are retiring, and every year there'll be more and more of them. And Social Security is already running deficits. I don't know how many people are aware of this. Yes. Are we okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I heard a beep. The Social Security taxes from their payroll tax, their income each year, which is used to pay benefits, in 2010 and every time since then, it's not been enough. There is not enough payroll tax income coming in to pay full benefits. So the government has had to borrow money, probably from the Chinese, in order to pay full benefits. In 2010, the first year, they were $49 billion short. And if they hadn't been able to borrow that, people would have been seeing their checks cut at that point. This year, it is estimated to be about $75 billion. That the revenue will be about $75 billion short of the cost of paying those benefits. Now, what they were supposed to do is sell $75 billion of those marketable treasury bonds and get the money. That was the whole system. But that, and so what is happening is the government is having to borrow, and if we had not had, buys a little time that the House Republicans sort of went along and we got this debt extension. It looked like we weren't going to get it. If they did not increase the debt ceiling, they could not have paid full benefits this year. People would start seeing because there's no money to back it up. It's only being able to borrow it, and the government has to be able to borrow that and has to be able to legally borrow it in order to pay full benefits at this time. But it can't keep going to that point because every year it gets to be larger and larger amounts.
Mm-hmm. So are there any imminent things on the horizon that show how this is going to turn around? Is it going to turn around, or is this just the way it is?
The only hope I can see is I'm doing a little bit of getting some of the seniors rallied up and so forth. The 78 million baby boomers or someplace in that neighborhood, they have the power to turn this around, but they're going to have to organize, take to the streets, and say, you stole our money, pay it back. That is the only thing I can see, and it's worked so many times, and the baby boomers have been involved in a lot of those things from Vietnam and other protests. The American public has to get up in arms about this. But in the meantime, the American public don't know this. Now, here's a point for me to go, who's looking out for your interests? If you think the AARP or the NCPSSM are looking out for seniors, they are not. They are saying the same thing that the government is saying. They have on their website, the government has enough money to pay full Social Security benefits for another 20 years without any kind of changes. It's a lie, and they know it's a lie. The government can't pay this year. They don't have enough money. And for them to say it, what they should be saying is, if none of this money had been stolen, the program, the 1983 tax, generated enough revenue, if the government hadn't stole it, to build up a fund, then we would have $2.7 trillion in the trust fund, and that would be enough to pay benefits for the next 20 years. But it's not there. It's all gone. Mm-hmm. And they are not recognizing that. They know it's gone. During my 13 years, I've been a member of both those organizations for many, many years. And the AARP has fought me from the very beginning. I sent a letter to William Novelli, who was the CEO at the time when my book, The Looting of Social Security, came out, and I sent him a bunch of copies, and I thought the AARP would be on my side helping. And I got a response back from him that you wouldn't believe, a scolding letter. How dare I bring up this subject of the looting of Social Security? He didn't deny it was taking place, but he said, we got to keep people's faith in it. He went along with the idea it was being looted, but he didn't want to tell the American people. And that's a role that they have continued to play. I think they're in the pockets of government, myself, the top leaders. They're echoing what the Social Security Administration is saying, and they are not looking out in any way for their members. It's people at the very top who are just, I just cannot understand it. And as I said, during my 13 years of trying to get this across, I've had no help. In fact, they wouldn't even respond to any of my correspondence by email or anything else. I begged the National Committee to let me come to Washington and bring my books and talk with their people and explain this. They wouldn't even respond to my request. And so I have no, even though I'm still a member, I have no contact whatsoever with an organization that could make all the difference. Mm-hmm. If the AARP would come out and acknowledge that the trust fund is empty and $2.7 trillion of the money has been taken, that would rally enough people to get out and get this issue out before the people. But as some people may or may not know that when William Novelli was when he was the CEO, he wrote the preface to a very ultra-conservative book by Newt Gingrich on a conservative approach to health care. And here's this guy, AARP, writing something that goes right in line with the whole conservative movement, So I think the people at the top, now the general membership is fine, but the people at the top, they've just been hijacked, and I think the American people, I'd like to see several thousand of you write letters or contact the ARP or write letters to the editor or local papers for this to come out, because they are not fighting for you.
Now, Alan, is there a website people can find out more?
Yes, I would love to have people go to my website, which is www.thebiglie.net. www.thebiglie.net. You will find stuff from my 13 years of this and my books and other things, but I just have got to urge people to do whatever you can. I need help. I mean, I've got a lot of followers all over the country in these 13 years. I've got a lawyer in California and so forth but there's not enough numbers. And now some of the organizations of senior citizens, some would get in on this. But here's the essential thing. The government has indeed, and when I use the word stolen, those words have been used by many senators and others. Let me just take a few things
Well,
here.
I'd love to be able to do that, but unfortunately, Alan, we're running out of time.
You're running out of time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if anybody gets a hold of my book, they look on the back and see. I mean, this is something that's well known by every member of Congress. President Obama says they can't pay Social Security unless they get these things through because there's no money. And well, I appreciate having the opportunity.
You bet, Alan. Go ahead and give out your website one more time.
www.thebiglie.net.
All right, Alan, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. We also want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in as well. Be sure to visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do have our weekly updates and hot links for you to find out more as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thanks again. This is Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.